What if you went to war to fight for a freedom that you yourself were denied at home? What if you crossed an ocean to prove your loyalty only to be handed a shovel instead of a rifle by your own army? And what if, when finally given the chance to fight, you became one of the most feared, respected, and decorated units in the entire war, only to come home and be forgotten? This isn't a Hollywood script. This is the true story of the 369th Infantry Regiment, the men the Germans called the Hellfighters, the Harlem Hellfighters. Part 1. A War for Democracy, a Nation Divided. Our story begins not in the muddy fields of France, but in the bustling, electric, and deeply segregated streets of 1917 America. The United States had just declared war on Germany, joining the Great War on April 6th. President Woodrow Wilson famously declared that the world must be made safe for democracy. But for the 3.7 million African Americans living in the United States, that democracy felt like a distant promise. In Harlem, New York, the vibrant heart of black culture and life, the call to arms was met with a complicated mixture of patriotism and frustration. How could they be asked to fight for democracy abroad when they were denied basic human rights at home? Jim Crow laws ruled the South, and even in the liberal North, segregation was a daily, humiliating reality. Yet thousands of black men rushed to enlist. They saw the war as a dual opportunity to serve their country, yes, but also to prove their manhood, their courage, and their undeniable claim to full citizenship. They believed that by shedding their blood on the battlefields of Europe, they could finally wash away the stain of prejudice back home. This overwhelming desire to serve led to the formation of several colored regiments. Among them was the 15th New York National Guard. From its inception, the 15th was different. It was a unit born from the dreams and determination of Harlem. It was led by a charismatic and politically savvy white officer, Colonel William Hayward. Hayward was no saint, but he was a pragmatist who genuinely believed in his men, and he fought tirelessly to get them the resources they were consistently denied. The men who filled the ranks were a cross-section of Harlem itself. There were porters and musicians, factory workers and lawyers, teenagers lying about their age, and veterans of the Spanish-American War. One of its most famous enlistees was James Reese Europe, a nationally celebrated musician and band leader. He believed that by bringing his music to the war, he could bring a piece of their humanity. He famously said, "I have come from France more firmly convinced than ever that Negroes should write Negro music. We have our own racial feeling, and if we try to copy whites, we will make bad copies." He would eventually lead the 369th Regimental Band, which would be credited with introducing live jazz music to Europe. But before they could become heroes, they had to endure humiliation. After basic training, the 15th New York was sent not to Europe, but to Spartanburg, South Carolina, for further combat training alongside white National Guard units. The reception was brutal. The white soldiers from both the North and South refused to train with them. The local white townspeople met them with open hostility and racial slurs. The men of the 15th were ordered to ignore the abuse, to turn the other cheek, for fear that any confrontation would give the army an excuse to disband them entirely. One of the regiment's most famous soldiers, Needham Roberts, would later recall the bitterness of that time. They were American soldiers in uniform, yet they were spat on, denied service in shops, and threatened with violence by the very people they had sworn to protect. The Army's solution was not to confront the racism, it was to remove the victim. In late 1917, fearing a race riot, the U.S. Army made a decision that would change the fate of the 15th New York forever. They declared the regiment unfit to be trained alongside white American troops. They would be shipped to France not as combat soldiers, but as a labor battalion. Their rifles were taken away. They were handed shovels, pickaxes, and brooms. As the ship carrying them, the SS Pocahontas, pulled out of New York Harbor in December 1917, the men didn't know what lay ahead. They had been denied the right to train for combat, disrespected by their own brothers in arms, and were now being sent to the world's most brutal war, armed as laborers. They had no idea they were sailing toward history. They had no idea that in the trenches of France they would earn a new name, one given to them by their terrified German enemies. And they had no idea that they would spend more time in continuous combat, 191 days, than any other unit in the entire war. Part 2. From Shovels to Rifles. The 369th Infantry Regiment arrived in France in January 1918, landing at the port of Brest. But any hope they had of immediately joining the fight was crushed. Just as they were in South Carolina, they were seen not as soldiers, but as a problem to be managed. General John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF, was a firm believer in segregation. The AEF had a problem: what to do with these black soldiers. The white American troops, known as doughboys, largely refused to fight alongside them. The AEF command, steeped in the prejudices of the era, issued a secret bulletin to the French military titled Secret Information Concerning Black American Troops. It warned the French not to spoil the black soldiers by treating them as equals, not to eat with them, and not to praise them too highly in front of white Americans. So the 369th was put to work. For weeks they did back-breaking manual labor. They unloaded supply ships in the freezing winter rain. They dug latrines and drainage ditches. They laid railroad tracks and built bridges. They were the muscle of the AEF, the support staff, performing the essential but unglamorous work that kept the war machine running, all while other American units were being trained for the front. Colonel Hayward was furious. His men had trained for war. They had crossed an ocean to fight. He relentlessly petitioned General Pershing, demanding a combat assignment. Meanwhile, the French army had a very different problem. By 1918, France was bleeding to death. After 4 years of catastrophic warfare, it was running out of men. The French military command, desperate for fresh troops to hold the line, was less concerned with a soldier's skin color than with his willingness to fight. They had already been fighting alongside their own colonial troops from Senegal, Algeria, and Morocco for years. A cold, pragmatic deal was struck. General Pershing still needed his French allies, but he didn't want to integrate his own forces. The French desperately needed reinforcements, regardless of their origin. The solution was unprecedented. Pershing loaned the 369th and several other black regiments to the French army. In March 1918, the 369th was formally transferred to the command of the French Fourth Army. The transition was immediate and stark. The Americans took away their U.S.-issued Springfield rifles and shovels. The French gave them French equipment, the long, thin Lebel rifle, the often unreliable Shoshat automatic rifle, and the distinctive Adrian steel helmet with its raised crest. They were given French rations, which included bread and, to their surprise, a daily allotment of wine, which was safer to drink than the local water. Most importantly, they were given a front. They were no longer laborers. They were now officially combat soldiers. They were sent to the Champagne-Marne sector, a brutal, war-torn stretch of the Western Front. For the first time, the men from Harlem, the musicians, the porters, the lawyers, stepped into the nightmare of trench warfare. It was a landscape from hell, a vast, moon-like craterscape of mud, shattered trees, and rotting bodies. The air hummed with the constant drone of artillery shells, the snap of sniper bullets, and the chatter of machine guns. They lived in deep, narrow ditches, battling not only the Germans, but also giant rats, which they called trench rabbits, lice, and the dreaded trench foot, a fungal infection that could lead to amputation. The French veterans, weary and cynical, expected these untested Americans to break. No one could have predicted what happened next. The 369th didn't just hold the line, they attacked. They conducted aggressive patrols into no man's land, the deadly stretch of barbed wire and shell holes between the two armies. They raided German trenches, capturing prisoners and, more importantly, capturing the attention of their enemy. The Germans, accustomed to war-weary opponents, were stunned by the ferocity of these new soldiers. They fought with a terrifying intensity, as if they had something to prove, which, of course, they did. It was the Germans who gave them their immortal nickname. Unable to break their lines and facing their relentless attacks, they called the 369th the Hellfighters. Part 3. The Stuff of Legends. The name was earned in blood, and two men, more than any others, would come to symbolize the unshakable courage of the Hellfighters in an event that sounded more like medieval legend than 20th century warfare. On a moonless night in May 1918, Private Henry Johnson, a former railroad porter from Albany, New York, and Private Needham Roberts, a young man from Trenton, New Jersey, were standing guard at a remote listening post, basically a glorified ditch, far out in no man's land. It was well past midnight. Suddenly, they heard a sound they had been warned about, the clip, clip, clip of wire cutters. A German raiding party, at least 24 strong, had crept through the darkness. Their mission was to capture prisoners for interrogation. Before Johnson or Roberts could even raise an alarm, a barrage of potato masher grenades exploded all around them. Roberts was hit badly, his arm and hip shredded by shrapnel. He fell back into the trench, unable to stand. The Germans swarmed over the top. Henry Johnson, who stood only 5'4", found himself facing a nightmare, but he did not run. He yelled for his comrades back in the main trench to alert them. He fired his 3-round French rifle until it was empty. As a German soldier jumped down on top of him, Johnson swung his rifle like a club, smashing the man's skull. He took a bullet to his own head, but the helmet saved him. He was shot in the arm. He saw 2 Germans trying to drag the wounded Needham Roberts away as a prisoner. Johnson pulled out his last weapon, a bolo knife. What happened next was described by a U.S. Army report as a whirlwind of fury. Johnson charged. He plunged the knife into the head of one German soldier. He disemboweled another. He was shot again in the leg, but kept fighting, screaming and slashing in the darkness. The German raiding party, which had outnumbered the two men by at least 12 to 1, had had enough. They had come for prisoners, but they had found a demon. They grabbed their wounded and fled back into the night. When the French reinforcements arrived, they found a scene of carnage. Henry Johnson, bleeding from 21 separate wounds, finally collapsed. He had single-handedly fought off the entire raid, saved his comrade from capture, and killed at least 4 Germans while wounding an estimated 10 to 20 more. The 369th had not given up an inch of ground, and they had not lost a single prisoner. This event, which became known as the Battle of Henry Johnson, was electrifying. The French, astounded by this display of valor, awarded both Johnson and Roberts the Croix de Guerre avec Palme, France's highest military honor for bravery. Henry Johnson's was the first ever awarded to an American soldier in the war. The story made the 369th famous. They had proven themselves. But their greatest test was yet to come. The Hellfighters were about to be thrown into one of the final, desperate offensives of the entire war, a meat grinder from which many would not return. Part 4. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive and Unbroken Lines. After the astonishing heroism of Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts, the reputation of the 396th Infantry Regiment soared. The French soldiers and commanders held them in the highest regard, often marveling at their tenacity and spirit. But back home, the American press either ignored their exploits or downplayed them, largely due to the prevailing racial prejudice. Yet word of the Hollenkampfer began to filter through, a whisper of black American courage that even segregation couldn't entirely silence. As summer turned to autumn in 1918, the Great War was entering its final, brutal phase. The Allied forces, bolstered by the arrival of fresh, albeit racially divided, American troops, planned a massive, coordinated offensive designed to break the German lines once and for all, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. This was to be the largest and bloodiest operation in American military history, involving over 1 million American soldiers over 47 days. The objective was to push through the Argonne Forest and beyond, severing critical German supply lines. It was a hellish landscape of dense woods, steep ravines, and well-fortified German positions. The French High Command, recognizing the Hellfighters' proven combat record, placed them directly in the thick of it. The 396th was assigned to some of the most difficult sectors, where the fighting was constant and merciless. For 191 consecutive days, the 396th Infantry Regiment held a frontline trench. This was the longest continuous combat service of any American regiment in World War I. Think about that. 191 days without relief, without a break from the constant shelling, the relentless patrols, the sniper fire, and the ever-present threat of German attack. Most units considered a few weeks on the front lines to be an eternity. The Hellfighters endured for over 6 months. They fought with unmatched ferocity. They advanced through poisoned gas attacks, through machine gun nests, and over fortified positions. They became masters of the raid, striking deep into enemy territory, disrupting German movements, and capturing vital intelligence. One particular incident showcases their unwavering determination. During a desperate German counterattack, a machine gun nest was causing heavy casualties. Sergeant Henry Lincoln Johnson, now a legend after his bolo knife heroics, was no longer fit for frontline duty due to his numerous wounds. But the spirit of such men permeated the regiment. The Hellfighters, under heavy fire, systematically outflanked the German position. They didn't just suppress it, They charged it, clearing it out with bayonets and grenades. Their regiment suffered heavy casualties, nearly 1,500 killed and wounded, but their resolve never wavered. They never lost a trench, they never gave ground, and they never had a single man captured by the enemy. Not one. Their regimental band, led by James Reese Europe, continued to play even near the front lines, boosting morale with its groundbreaking jazz music. The sounds of syncopated rhythms and lively brass filled the brief lulls in battle, providing a stark and beautiful contrast to the horrors around them. These weren't just soldiers, they were artists, musicians, and ordinary men doing extraordinary things. As the offensive pushed deeper into German territory, the Hellfighters distinguished themselves repeatedly. They participated in crucial actions that led to the collapse of German resistance. Their reputation grew even among the Germans, who now respected their fighting prowess, even if they feared it. They knew that facing the Hohenkampfer meant to fight to the death. The war ended on November 11, 1918. The armistice was signed, and the guns fell silent. After 4 grueling years, the senseless slaughter was over. For the men of the 396th, it was a moment of profound relief, but also of deep introspection. They had done their duty, and more. They had fought for democracy abroad, proving their loyalty and courage beyond any doubt. They had earned an incredible number of decorations from the French army, including 171 individual Croix de Guerre medals. The entire regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Palm for their collective bravery. They were hailed as heroes by the French, lauded in French newspapers, and celebrated by the very people whose freedom they had helped secure. But as they prepared to return home, a gnawing question lingered. Would their heroism in the trenches of France finally translate into equality in the streets of America? Had their blood truly washed away the stain of prejudice? The journey home would be another kind of battle. Part 5. Triumphant Return, Unjust Reality. The return of the Harlem Hellfighters to the United States in February 1919 was at first a moment of profound celebration. They were among the very first American units to return home from France, brought back on the troopship USS Stockholm. As they disembarked in New York Harbor, thousands of people lined the docks, cheering. But the real triumph was yet to come. On February 17, 1919, New York City threw a parade for the 369th Infantry Regiment. It was unlike anything seen before. Led by their band playing rousing jazz tunes, the Hellfighters marched up Fifth Avenue past jubilant crowds estimated to be in the hundreds of thousands. White and black New Yorkers stood side by side, cheering. Confetti rained down. Banners proclaimed them welcome home heroes. It was a moment of unparalleled pride for Black America. These men who had been denied the right to fight by their own country, who had been handed shovels instead of rifles, had returned as decorated warriors. Their French Croix de Guerre medals gleamed on their chests. Colonel Hayward, beaming, marched at their head. James Reese Europe's band filled the air with music that would soon captivate the world. For one glorious day, the color lines seemed to blur. For one glorious day, the Hellfighters were simply American heroes. But the parade ended, and as the echoes of the cheers faded, the harsh reality of Jim Crow America reasserted itself with brutal force. Many of the returning black veterans, still in their uniforms, found themselves immediately confronted by the same prejudice they had left behind. In the South, a black soldier in uniform was often seen as an affront, a challenge to the racial hierarchy. They were told to remove their uniforms. They were denied service in restaurants and stores. They were subjected to violence and intimidation. The belief that their wartime service would earn them respect and equality was shattered. Instead, 1919 became known as Red Summer, a period of intense racial violence across the United States as white mobs attacked black communities and returning black veterans who dared to assert their rights. Henry Johnson, the hero of the bolo knife, returned to a segregated America that largely ignored his valor. Though he toured recounting his story and advocating for black veterans, his injuries left him crippled. He struggled to find work, fell into alcoholism, and died a pauper in 1929, largely forgotten by the nation he had so bravely served. His medals from France were his only tangible recognition for decades. It would take nearly a century for the U.S. government to properly honor him, awarding him the Purple Heart in 1996 and the Medal of Honor in 2015. Needham Roberts, his comrade in that famous fight, also faced similar struggles. Many other Hellfighters found themselves jobless, their sacrifices seemingly forgotten by their own government. James Reese Europe, the pioneering band leader, also suffered a tragic fate. Shortly after the parade, in May 1919, he was fatally stabbed by one of his own band members during a dispute. His death was a tremendous loss to both the music world and the black community. The story of the Harlem Hellfighters is a profound paradox. They were heroes abroad, fighting for an ideal of democracy that was denied to them at home. They achieved unparalleled feats of courage and endurance, earning the respect of their allies and the fear of their enemies. Yet their triumph was met with injustice and, for too long, silence. Their legacy, however, is far from forgotten. Their unwavering spirit, their refusal to be broken, and their incredible bravery paved the way for future generations of black soldiers and civil rights activists. They showed the world, and more importantly, they showed America what black men were capable of when given the chance. The Harlem Hellfighters forced a crack in the wall of segregation, a crack that would eventually widen, leading to the desegregation of the U.S. military in 1948, and ultimately to the civil rights movement. They were more than just soldiers. They were pioneers. They were symbols. They were the men who went to hell and back, not just to fight a foreign enemy, but to fight for the very soul of their nation. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of courage, resilience, and the fight for justice against all odds. Their legend, the legend of the Hollenkampfer, continues to inspire, reminding us that true heroism knows no color, and that the fight for democracy is often fought on many fronts. They fought for a world that wouldn't acknowledge their worth, but in doing so, they forged a legacy that demands our recognition, our respect, and our eternal remembrance. They were the Harlem Hellfighters, and their story is etched forever in the annals of history.